Thank you all for coming. I first met Barry Schwabsky in the last century when he was the editor of the estimable Arts magazine, and I wrote something for him, and as I remember, this may be faulty memory, it went very smoothly, and this gave me a false and entirely unrealistic expectation of editor-writer relations that caused me problems for years to come. Schwabsky is a poet and critic who now lives in London, but he was born in Paterson, New Jersey, and came to poetry when he found out that someone had actually written a long poem about his hometown. He read Dr. Williams' poem, one thing led to another, and he was hooked. His books of poetry include Opera, Ways, and Fate Seen in the Dark, and there's a new one coming out this year from Black Square Editions, yes?
Yes. So I hear.
He's the author of many books of art criticism, including The Widening Circle, Consequences of Modernism and Contemporary Art, and he has contributions in Vitamin P, New Perspectives in Painting, and The Painting of Modern Life that Ralph Rugoff did. And to books on artists Jessica Stockholder, Gillian Waring, Betty Woodman, and Karen Davey. He's also rumored to have written books on male artists. He writes regularly for Art Forum and is a co-editor of the International Reviews section, and is showing up pretty often lately in The Nation, most recently with a piece on Courbet. When Tom Beckett recently asked him why he writes poetry, Schwabsky said he does it, quote, out of a fascination with language and a surmise that can lead to the heart of being. Good answer. Barry Schwabsky.
Thanks very much. It did go smoothly until I think somehow they didn't pay you as much as they were supposed to, or something like that. But you know, that's the critics' usual problem. The title of the talk I'm giving tonight is Object or Project, a critic's reflection on the ontology of art. And I'm going to be assisted in this by my friend Warren Yacheslavsky.
La conférence s'intitule Objet ou projet, objekt, czyli projekt, refleksji krytyka sztuki o ontologii malarstwa, réflexion d'un critique d'art sur l'ontologie de la peinture.
And so the reflections that I want to share with you this evening began to crystallize themselves for me a while back when I was invited to participate in a conference on the present state of painting sponsored by the University of Copenhagen.
Ces réflexions se sont cristallisées, se sont mises à cristalliser lors de ma participation dans un colloque sur l'état présent de la peinture dans un colloque à Copenhague.
Where I was specifically invited to be part of a panel addressing the ontology of painting.
J'étais spécifiquement invité pour adresser le sujet de l'ontologie de la peinture.
At first I was worried about not being entirely sure how to go about this.
J'étais inquiet dès l'abord, n'étant pas tout à fait sûr comment m'y mettre.
It's really a matter for a philosopher, I thought.
C'est plutôt une matière de philosophe, me suis dit.
But I'll do my best.
Je ferai de mon mieux.
In any case, I knew that as an interlocutor there, I would have a professional philosopher whom I trusted to correct anything really wrong-headed I might happen to say.
En tout cas, je savais que j'aurais comme interlocuteur un philosophe de profession à qui j'aurais confiance de me corriger pour toute chose mal conçue.
To put it in the simplest possible way, I was concerned about whether the word I should be taking most seriously was ontology or painting.
Pour le prendre au plus simple, j'étais pas sûr si je devais mettre la priorité sur l'ontologie ou la peinture.
That's not to say that my concern was somehow one about emphasis. about whether I should concentrate more on the ontology aspect of the topic or on the painting aspect.
Ce n'est pas dire que c'était une question d'emphase, de priorité sur un côté ou l'autre.
If that were the biggest problem, I would have been more confident that I could deal with it, at least in some rough and ready sort of way.
Si c'était bien ça le problème, j'avais une certaine confiance que je serais capable quand même de l'aborder, ne serait-ce que le pied levé.
No, what worried me was rather that there might be a sort of contradiction between the two terms.
Ce qui me faisait des soucis, c'est qu'il pourrait y avoir des contradictions entre les deux termes.
That there really is no ontology of painting and that therefore it is strictly speaking impossible to talk about it, even though one might separately talk about ontology or about painting.
C'est-à-dire que la chose n'existe pas, il n'y a pas d'ontologie de la peinture, qu'on peut parler soit de l'ontologie, soit de la peinture, mais pas des deux.
But how can that be? Why would I think that?
Mais comment ça pourrait se faire? Pourquoi croirais-je ça?
Since paintings certainly exist, it ought to be possible to say something about the nature of their being.
Comme la peinture, les peintures existent bien, et ça devrait être possible de dire quelque chose sur le statut ontologique.
Well, yes, of course. But that's not yet sufficient for there to be an ontology of painting.
Oui, bien évidemment, mais cela ne suffit pas pour qu'il y ait une ontologie de la peinture.
In order for us to be able to talk about such a thing, there would need to be something particular about painting and nothing else but painting with regard to being.
Pour qu'on puisse réellement en parler, il faudrait qu'il y ait quelque chose de spécifique à la peinture et rien qu'à la peinture.
Painting would have to be a particular category of being.
Il faudrait que la peinture soit une catégorie particulière de l'être.
To clarify this, let's go back to a classic philosophical example that I remember from my freshman year at college.
Pour clarifier le problème, remontons à l'exemple classique dont je me souviens bien de la première année de mes études.
Plato, as we all know, taught that what is real is a form or idea.
Platon, comme nous le savons bien, a enseigné que tout ce qu'on connaît, c'est une forme, une idée.
And to illustrate this, he said that when a carpenter makes a chair, he constructs an object out of wood in accordance with its idea.
Pour illustrer l'exemple, il a dit que quand un charpentier construit une chaise, il construit une chaise, une bois, selon les règles d'art, d'après une idée.
The wooden chair is merely a representation of the idea.
La chaise en bois n'est qu'une représentation de l'idée.
Further, he ventured, if a painter were to paint a picture of the chair, the painted chair would be a representation of a representation, something at two removes from real being.
Il poursuit, si un peintre se mit à peindre une chaise, la peinture, le toile, l'image, le tableau de la chaise serait une représentation d'une représentation à 2 degrés de distance de l'idée.
In this case, we can see that ideas have a certain ontological status, which, according to Plato, is, so to speak, fully vested.
Dans ce cas-ci, on voit, selon Platon, que les idées ont un statut ontologique très clair, pleinement investi.
Whereas objects, such as chairs, being at one remove from ideas, possess an ontological status that is subordinate.
Tandis que les objets n'ayant pas la réalité des idées possèdent un statut ontologique subordonné.
And then images, at two removes from the fully fledged reality of the ideas, possess an even lesser ontological status than objects.
Et les images à 2 degrés de distance de l'idée possèdent un statut encore moindre.
Which is perhaps what Joseph Kosuth was implying in this Platonic meditation on chairs that I'm
Ce qui est peut-être ce qu'impliquait Joseph Kosuth dans cette réflexion platonicienne sur la chaise.
Obviously, I'm not concerned here with the possible validity of Plato's ontological rankings, which, after a few thousand years, may seem rather dubious.
Et évidemment, ce qui ne me concerne pas ici, ce n'est pas le statut des postulats ontologiques de Platon qui, à 2 millénaires de distance, peut paraître bien douteux.
And I'm not interested in the arguments of certain Platonists or Neoplatonists who believe that they could finesse the master's condemnation of painting on the grounds that the image might in reality be closer to the idea than the object is.
Et je ne m'intéresse pas non plus à certains arguments des platoniciens et néoplatoniciens et qui postulent que peut-être quelque part l'image est en fait plus près de l'idée.
Nor does my problem lie mainly in the fact that after the invention, first of painting, then of photography, and last but not least of digital technology, the word painting can hardly be equated in any simple sense with the words picture or image.
Mon problème non plus n'est qu'après l'invention de la peinture et après de l'imprimerie et après de la photographie, et maintenant, last but not least, à la technologie digitale, le mot peinture peut à peine être traité de façon simple en utilisant le mot picture, le mot latin picture ou image.
Unlike ancient times, there is now a multitude of ways to convey an image.
Contrairement à l'Antiquité, il y a maintenant une multitude de façons d'aborder l'image.
And the implicit synonymy of painting an image has been prized open.
Et la synonymie implicite de la peinture et l'image a été, pour ainsi dire, forcée ou éclatée.
Rather, I just want to point out that in illustrating his theory of being, Plato used chairs and paintings as examples, but could hardly be said to have been offering an ontology of painting any more than he was offering an ontology of carpentry.
Je veux simplement indiquer que, en illustrant de cette façon sa théorie, Platon utilisait les chaises et les tableaux, les images comme exemple. Mais on pourrait guère le soupçonner de proposer une ontologie de la peinture en tant que telle, pas plus qu'il offrait une ontologie de la charpenterie.
Instead, one can speak of the distinctive ontologies of ideas, objects, and images.
En fait, au lieu de ça, on peut plutôt parler des ontologies distinctives des idées, des objets et des images.
That is to say, kinds of being can be differentiated only at a much more general categorical level than that of painting, at least in a philosophical setting like that offered by Plato.
Cela revient à dire que des genres d'êtres peuvent être différenciés uniquement à un niveau catégorique beaucoup plus général que celle de peinture, au moins dans un cadre philosophique comme tel que propose Platon.
Not to say that painting may not have a character that is distinctive from other modes of art making, just that its difference would not reside at this level of generality.
Ce n'est pas dire que la peinture n'a pas un caractère distinctif d'autres modes de art-making, du faire de l'art, simplement que ces différences ne résident pas à ce niveau-là et de généralité.
Would this still be the case according to modern and contemporary theories of being?
Serait-il toujours le cas selon les théories modernes et contemporaines de l'être?
Not being a philosopher, as I said, it's hard for me to be sure, but I suspect something similar would be the case.
N'étant pas philosophe, ça m'est difficile de dire, d'en être sûr, mais je soupçonne, je doute que quelque chose de pareil, en fait, est le cas.
However, my concern comes not from contemporary debates in philosophy, but rather from discussions about art.
Mais mes soucis tournent autour non pas des débats contemporains en philosophie, mais plutôt des discussions sur l'art.
It comes from qualms about the categorical status of painting as distinguished from other artistic practices, as these are understood by contemporary artists as well as by critics, historians, and theorists of art.
Mes scrupules proviennent du statut catégorique de la peinture, comme on le distingue des autres pratiques artistiques, comme entendent ces pratiques artistiques les artistes contemporains, aussi bien que critiques, historiens et théoriciens de l'art.
Simply put, such discussions make it hard to see how, given a desire to speak of ontology at all, one could speak of an ontology of painting rather than more generally of an ontology of art.
Pour le dire tout simplement, ces discussions-là le rendent difficile de concevoir étant donné un désir de parler de l'ontologie tout court, on peut réellement parler d'une ontologie de la peinture plutôt que plus généralement d'une ontologie de l'art.
This goes back to issues I've discussed before, particularly in my introduction to the book Vitamin P.
Tout ça remonte à des discussions que moi j'ai conduites avant, surtout dans l'introduction à mon livre Vitamine P.
In writing that text, I had to wonder why, above all today, do we need a book about painting and not simply a book about art?
En écrivant ce livre-là, j'étais acculé à réfléchir et me demander pourquoi, en fait, on devrait écrire un livre sur l'ontologie de la peinture et pas sur l'ontologie de l'art tout court.
In order to give myself a satisfactory answer to the question, in order to justify my hunch that after all and despite everything, there was a particularity to painting that finally did justify its being separated out from other kinds of art,
pour me fournir à moi-même une réponse satisfaisante à la question et afin de justifier mon intuition personnelle qu'après tout, et malgré tout, il y avait une particularité à la peinture qui en fait justifie bien cette séparation.
I had to examine the notion, quite common in today's art world, really a sort of shibboleth, according to which contemporary painting, or at least contemporary painting of any significance, is essentially conceptual.
Je devrais mettre à l'examen l'idée courante, on pourrait même dire un shibboleth auprès des critiques et historiens de l'art, que toute peinture valable contemporaine est une espèce de peinture conceptuelle.
After all, I continued, as long ago as the late 1950s, certain artists, as Thierry de Dufus put it, felt it necessary to produce generic art, that is, art that has severed its ties with the specific crafts and traditions of either painting or sculpture.
En fait, aussi récemment que les années 50, comme a démontré Thierry de Duve, les artistes se sentaient déjà contraints à se séparer des pratiques artisanales dans leur art, pratiques artisanales traditionnelles de la peinture.
The artists who began producing happenings and environments around the end of the 1950s
Les artistes qui se sont mis à produire des environnements et des happenings vers la fin des années 50.
For instance, Alan Caprow, whose work you see here, or George Brecht, Robert Whitman, and so on.
Ici, on voit Alain Caprow, il y avait aussi Georges Brecht et Robert Whitman.
Were among the first of these, soon to be followed by the practitioners of minimalism and conceptual art.
C'était que les premiers, bientôt suivis des pratiquants de l'art minimaliste et conceptuel.
Minimalism, for instance, represented by Donald Judd, who here also takes up the issue of the chair.
Le minimalisme est ici illustré par Donald Judd, qui aussi prend en compte la question de la chaise.
But today, this desire for an art not limited to any particular métier or medium has become general.
Mais maintenant, ce souci est devenu général.
This can be seen, for instance, in the fact that fewer and fewer art schools require their students to enroll in departments of painting, sculpture, or printmaking.
On voit la confirmation de cette idée dans le fait qu'il y a de moins en moins d'académies d'art qui exigent de leurs étudiants qu'ils s'inscrivent dans des départements de peinture, sculpture, etc.
In the new de-skilled academy, there is typically one overarching department of, say, visual arts.
Dans cette nouvelle académie de-skilled, c'est-à-dire désartisanalisée, il y a maintenant un département général qui surplombe le tout.
And the students
des arts plastiques ou visuels, comme on dit en anglais.
And the students are expected to apply ad hoc whichever techniques happen to be most appropriate to a given project.
Et on s'attend des étudiants qu'ils appliquent des techniques particulières appropriées à chaque projet.
Still, it must be admitted that all works of art do have certain things in common.
Malgré tout, on doit admettre que toute œuvre d'art possède quelque chose en commun avec d'autres œuvres d'art.
Certain minimal attributes without which an object cannot be received as a work of art.
Certains attributs minimaux sont lesquels une œuvre ne peut pas être reçue comme une œuvre d'art.
It seems to me that these are at least 4.
Il me semble qu'il y en ait au moins 4.
In order to count as an artwork, an object must be endowed with 1, a title,
Pour être compté comme une œuvre d'art, un objet doit être doté au moins d'un titre,
2, a date,
une date,
3, an enumeration of materials,
tertio, une énumération du matériau et matériel,
and of course, above all, 4th, it
Et-
must have the name of an artist.
et en quatrième et avant tout, elle doit porter le nom d'un artiste,
Whose role may be in part to supply the other 3.
dont le rôle en partie pourrait être simplement de fournir les autres 3.
If you go to any museum or gallery in the world, the things you see will have these.
Si on va à n'importe quel musée ou galerie dans le monde entier, les choses qu'on y verra posséderont ces qualités,
Or else they will be things that just happen to be there without being artworks.
ou bien ce seraient des choses qui sont là simplement sans être des œuvres d'art.
The benches, sometimes provided for viewers to sit on while contemplating a painting, will not typically have a title, date, list of materials, or artist.
Les bancs ou les banquettes qu'on fournit des fois pour les spectateurs pour qu'ils s'asseyent en contemplant un tableau n'auront pas de cartel avec la liste de matériel, titre, date et nom d'artiste.
The fact that title, date, and materials are unavoidable demands placed on any object that might be considered an artwork means that the provision of these has become as much a part of the artist's job description, so to speak, as anything else.
Le fait que titre, date, matériel sont incontournables, des exigences incontournables exigées de tout objet qui pourrait être considéré une œuvre d'art, veut dire que la provision de celle-ci est devenue autant une partie intégrante du devoir professionnel de l'artiste, pour ainsi dire, que toute autre qualité.
No artist can avoid giving a title to her work, and even untitled counts as a title.
Aucun artiste, aucune artiste ne peut éviter de donner un titre à son œuvre, à son travail, et même le courant untitled, sans titre, compte comme un titre.
Often a most informative one, for instance, when it clues the viewer into the formalist underpinnings of the artist's project.
Et des fois, des plus informatifs, par exemple, quand il fournit des indices aux spectateurs, quant au soubassement formaliste du projet de l'artiste.
Perhaps more interesting because less noticed is the way certain artists formulate descriptions of the materials they use.
Encore plus intéressant, parce que moins noté, c'est la façon dont certains artistes formulent des descriptions du matériel dont ils se servent.
One might have expected to read that the materials of Joseph Marioni's monochrome paintings, like this one, consist of acrylic on canvas.
On pourrait s'attendre à lire sur le cartel que le matériau d'un toile monochrome de Joseph Marioni consiste des mots peinture acrylique sur toile.
But his insistence that they be described instead as acrylic on canvas on stretcher alerts us to the fact that our materialism will have to go deeper than usual if we are to engage with his work most attentively and rewardingly.
Ale jego naleganie, że musimy je opisać raczej akryl na płótnie, na blejtramach, nous alerte au fait que notre matérialisme aura encore aller plus loin que d'habitude si on devrait réellement engager avec son travail attentivement et, disons, de façon connaissante et reconnaissante.
Likewise, to realize that Lawrence Wiener's text works are not described as, say, vinyl lettering on wall, but rather as language and the materials referred to, is to learn about, indeed, the work's ontological location.
De même, quand on se rend compte que les œuvres textuelles de Laurence Wiener, on ne les décrit pas, disons, lettres vinyles sur mur, mais plutôt comme langage et les matériels, le matériau auquel il se réfère, est à apprendre quelque chose justement sur la location ontologique et de l'œuvre.
And the specular mise en abîme generated by materials being used as a key word in the inventory of materials is altogether to the point.
Et la mise en abîme spéculaire présentée par le mot materials, matériaux, utilisé comme le mot-clé dans l'inventaire du matériau, est tout à fait la clé de la question.
The fact that McDermott and McGuff would date paintings and photographs produced in the 1980s and 90s back to the 1890s is the clearest example of how artists sometimes play with the dating of their works.
Ou bien quand McDermott et McDuff datent des tableaux et des photographes produits pendant les années 80 du XXe siècle, ils les redatent en 1890 et en est peut-être l'exemple le plus clair.
And of course, that the artist's name is part of his or her plastic material is so obvious that it need only be pointed out.
Et bien évidemment, le fait que le nom de l'artiste fasse partie du matériel plastique est tellement évident qu'il suffit de l'indiquer.
Whose mother ever gave her son a name like Assume Vivid Astrofocus, the author of this work?
Quelle mère donnerait à son fils un nom comme Assume Vivid Astrofocus?
In the Renaissance, artists had to produce works in accordance with iconographic programs laid down by churchmen and humanists.
Dans la Renaissance, les artistes avaient à produire des œuvres selon les règles des programmes iconographiques conçus par des clercs et des humanistes.
Under the market conditions of modernity, they became required to invent their own subjects.
Et sous les conditions de marché de la modernité, on exige d'eux d'inventer leur propre sujet.
In contrast to conventional accounts whereby subject matter becomes more and more expendable as the 20th century approaches and abstraction becomes a possibility,
en contraste au récit conventionnel où la matière, le sujet, deviennent de plus en plus une chose dont on peut se passer avec l'approche du XXe siècle,
it really becomes more and more crucially a part of the artist's task to arrive at a subject.
Ça devient une partie intégrante de la tâche de l'artiste d'arriver lui-même à un sujet.
All the more so if the work is abstract.
D'autant plus si l'œuvre est abstraite.
And that's why, when some of the New York abstract expressionists contemplated founding the school, the name they chose for it was precisely the subjects of the artist.
Et c'est pourquoi, quand quelques-uns des expressionnistes abstraits new-yorkais contemplaient de fonder une école, le nom qu'ils ont choisi, c'était précisément les sujets de l'artiste.
Finally, with postmodernity, the artist has to produce not so much the work itself,
et à la fin, avec la postmodernité, l'artiste a à produire non tant l'œuvre elle-même.
as we'll see, there exist artists whose every effort is to reduce the work to its vanishing point.
Et comme on verra, il existe des artistes dont tout effort se résume à réduire l'œuvre à son point de fuite.
Or even to produce its subject,
Ou même produire son sujet,
its myth, as we will see that it can be called,
son mythe, comme on verra l'épithète juste.
as its catalogability, if there is such a word.
aussi bien que sa catalogabilité, s'il y a un tel mot.
In any case, those four minimal attributes of the artwork are so indispensable precisely because they are requisite to any attempt to understand the work's relation to the project that generated it.
Mais en tout cas, les quatre attributs minimaux dont on parlait de l'œuvre d'art sont indispensables précisément parce que ils sont requis dans chaque tentative de comprendre la relation de l'œuvre au projet qu'il a généré.
The October 2005 issue of Artforum, the magazine with which I work most closely,
Le numéro octobre 2005 de Artforum, la revue avec laquelle je travaille de façon plus étroite,
devoted no less than 3 articles to the work of the German painter, but perhaps we should be very tentative in using that word here, Michael Kreber.
a dévoué non moins de 3 articles à l'œuvre du peintre, mais ici on propose le mot peintre tentativement, Michel Kreber.
I'd like to take a look at these 3 essays to use them as examples.
Je voudrais regarder de plus près ces 3 essais pour m'en servir comme exemple.
Because they represent a certain range and quantity of consensus opinion on the same subject in a concentrated dose and from an authoritative source.
Puisqu'ils représentent une certaine gamme et quantité d'opinions consensuelles sur ce même sujet, dans une dose très concentrée,
I'm not going to try and summarize.
et de sources autoritatives.
I'm not going to try and summarize what each one of the 3 critics says.
Je ne vais pas essayer de résumer ce que disent ces 3 critiques.
And in any case, their modes of discourse are not necessarily based on the presentation of structured arguments that can easily be reduced to a précis.
Et en tout cas, leurs modes de discours ne sont pas forcément basés sur la présentation d'arguments structurés qu'on pourrait facilement réduire à un précis,
But simply to quote certain value-laden passages and expressions that seem significant and in some way typical.
mais simplement je citerai certains passages très chargés, très valorisants, et des expressions qui me semblent significatives et quelque part typiques.
According to Daniel Birnbaum, director of the Städelschule in Frankfurt,
Selon Daniel Birnbaum, directeur de la Städelschule à Francfort,
Kreber's art is a zone of contagion, a space for conversation rather than a mode of producing objects.
l'art de Kreber est une zone de contagion, un espace de conversation plutôt qu'un mode de produire des objets.
Birnbaum also relays what he refers to as Kreber's oft-repeated claim that he was working on his myth long before his paintings.
Birnbaum transmet aussi ce dont il parle comme la façon dont Kreber revendiquait son mythe bien avant qu'il commençait à revendiquer ses tableaux.
Although after some early work based on the ready-made, Kreber has systematically turned to painting,
Après certains travaux initiaux basés sur le ready-made, le tout-fait, Kreber a systématiquement tourné à la peinture.
Birnbaum says this is not to suggest that he has finally found a technique or subject matter with which he feels authentically at home.
Birnbaum dit, ce n'est pas à suggérer qu'il a enfin trouvé une technique ou un sujet ou une matière avec laquelle il se sent authentiquement chez lui.
Instead, Birnbaum continues, what look like paintings are often in fact altered ready-mades.
Mais Birnbaum poursuit, en fait, ce qui peut ressembler à des tableaux, en fait, souvent, ce sont des tout-faits, des ready-made altérés.
As in the case of some naively exotic-looking cheetah pictures from 2003, which are actually found pieces of fabric put on a stretcher.
Comme dans le cas de certains tableaux naïfs et exotisantes des cheetahs qui, en fait, sont des bouts de tissu trouvés qui ont été montés sur cadre.
I should point out that although Birnbaum dutifully notes Kreber's propensity for making works that resemble or quote other German painters, such as Sigmar Polke, Martin Kippenberger, or Albert Erlin,
Bien que Birnbaum, de façon très scrupuleuse, note la propensité de Kreber pour faire des œuvres qui ressemblent ou qui citent d'autres peintres allemands tels que Sigmar Polke, Martin Kippenberger ou Albert Erlin,
he neglects to mention that this appropriation of found textiles, as in this painting here,
et il omet de mentionner que cette appropriation de textiles, de tissus trouvés,
is a move that goes back to Blinky Palermo's work in the 70s, of which this is an example.
est un move, un geste qui remonte à l'œuvre de Blinky Palermo aux années 70,
With the difference that Palermo never used fabric with images, only monochromatic fields.
à la différence près que Palermo se servait jamais d'images, simplement de toiles avec images, simplement avec des champs monochromes.
The New York-based critic John Kelsey begins his essay by contrasting Kreber with other painters based on differences in the sheer quantity of paint their practices entail.
Le critique new-yorkais John Kelsey commence en contrastant Kreber avec d'autres peintres selon le critère de la différence de la quantité de la peinture entraînée par le pratique.
All the paint in Kreber's last two shows here, says Kelsey, that is in New York, couldn't fill one small canvas by Dana Schutz.
Il cite toute la peinture des deux dernières expositions de Kreber ne remplirait pas un petit toile de Dana Schutz ou de John Curran.
Or of John Curran.
Pardon.
Thus, Kreber demonstrated, by contrast, according to Kelsey, that the proof is not in the paint job, but in the idea that puts it at a fresh distance.
Donc Kreber démontre par contraste que la démonstration n'est pas dans le travail artisanal du peintre, de la peinture.
Kelsey portrays Kreber as a man motivated by his aversion to labor.
Kelsey dépeint Kreber comme un homme motivé par son aversion au travail.
In Kelsey's words, he uses painting as a strategy for extricating himself from the wrong kind of work, both the bad works that surround him and the bad works he, like anybody, is capable of.
Dixit Kelsey, il se sert de la peinture comme stratégie pour s'extriquer du mauvais travail et les mauvais travaux qui l'entourent, et le mauvais travail qui l'entoure, et les mauvaises œuvres que lui, comme n'importe qui, est capable de produire.
Or from the demands of work, period.
Ou tout simplement des exigences et de l'exigence du travail.
This is the typically Duchampian strategic detachment, not so much of art from labor as it might seem, but rather of intellectual from manual labor.
Ceci représente le détachement stratégique typiquement duchampien, non tant de l'art du travail, comme ça pourrait le sembler, mais plutôt du travail manuel, du travail intellectuel.
This is obviously Kreber again. Thus, the importance to Kelsey of the phrase paint job, which he uses more than once.
Donc, l'importance à Kelsey du terme paint job, c'est-à-dire le travail manuel de peindre qu'il utilise plus d'une fois.
It suggests that merely depositing paint on a surface is a menial manual task, the toil of a common laborer.
Ça suggère que simplement déposer la peinture sur une surface est une tâche manuelle laborieuse d'un ouvrier commun.
And it seems that it is when work turns into works
Et il semble que quand œuvrer devient œuvre,
when ideas or at least activity become embodied in objects,
quand les idées ou au moins l'activité s'incarnent dans les objets,
that the results are liable to turn out, quote, bad, close quote.
que les résultats sont susceptibles de devenir, entre guillemets, mauvais.
Kelsey suggests that Kreber even goes a step further than Duchamp.
Kelsey propose ou suggère que Kreber dévance Duchamp.
Kreber's approach underlines the fact that artists are ready-made too, and that ready-mades can be unmade.
L'approche de Kreber souligne le fait que les artistes sont des ready-made, des tout-faits, et que tout fait peut être défait.
As a result of this self-consciousness about the contingent status, not so much of painting as of being a painter,
Donc le résultat de cette conscience et hyperconscience sur le statut contingent, non tant de la peinture que du statut du peintre,
Kreber, in Kelsey's words, is less a painter than a strategist, and his strategy is to repeat and stop painting in order to go to work on the wider system that makes painting what it is today.
Citant, Kreber est moins un peintre qu'un stratège ou stratège, comme disait autrefois, et que sa stratégie consiste à répéter et puis arrêter la peinture afin de travailler le système plus large qui fait de la peinture ce qu'elle est aujourd'hui.
And as for the objects, the paintings in quotes, that result from these strategies, they are hardly to be dwelt on for long.
Et quant aux objets, les tableaux, entre guillemets, qui résultent de ces stratégies, on n'a pas à y attarder très longtemps.
As Kelsey says, it is probably less interesting to interpret the meaning of a ready-made checkered bedsheet or one depicting a moonlit galloping horse than to realize that this throwaway image in its very meaninglessness is here being reclaimed as pure means.
Il est probablement moins intéressant d'interpréter la signification d'un ready-made, d'un tout-fait qui consiste d'un drap en carreau ou d'un toile qui dépeint un cheval galopant sous le clair de la lune, que de se rendre compte que cette image jetable, dans son sans signifiance même, est en fait est réclamée comme moyen pur.
In other words, Kelsey continues, such a gesture doesn't care to fulfill any particular end, to succeed in accomplishing some ultimate significance or work.
Pour le dire autrement, il poursuit, un tel geste ne cherche pas à réaliser un but particulier, à réussir à accomplir une signification ultime, ultérieure du travail.
What matters in an art like this, or rather to an artist like this, is a sort of virtuosity in escaping everyone's grasp.
Pour un art comme ça, pour un artiste comme ça, il s'agit de la virtuosité d'échapper à la compréhension de quiconque.
It's precisely this talent for diversion and lack of fixity, according to the third contributor to Artforum's discussion of Kreber, that has made him an important reference point for younger artists, both in Europe and in the US.
C'est précisément ce talent pour, citant, la diversion et le manque de fixité, selon le troisième contributeur à la discussion d'Artforum sur Kreber, qui a fait de lui une référence importante pour les artistes plus jeunes et en Europe et aux États-Unis.
For all that, however, this writer, Jessica Morgan, a curator of contemporary art at the Tate Modern in London, is somewhat more measured in her praise for Kreber than are her two colleagues.
Malgré tout cela, pourtant, cet écrivain, cette critique, Jessica Morgan, curatrice d'art contemporain au Tate Modern à Londres, dans ses éloges, est plutôt mesurée.
She sees his work as a repertoire of endgame maneuvers, and for that reason as a possibly unsuitable model for young artists.
Dans son travail, elle voit plutôt un répertoire de manœuvres de fin de partie, et dans cette mesure, il est peut-être un modèle qui ne convient pas réellement aux jeunes artistes.
While a consummate knowledge of his immediate cultural context protects him from any accusations of naivete or misguided notions of originality, according to Morgan, the weight of his inheritance leaves room for just the slightest of activities.
Et alors qu'une connaissance magistrale de son contexte culturel immédiat le protège des accusations de naïveté ou de notions mal conçues d'originalité, le poids de son héritance ne laisse de la place qu'à la moindre d'activité.
While Morgan's understated yearning for an art practice that might still be just sufficiently naive or misguided enough to risk something more than Alexandrian tinkering with the edges of one's context is a desire I'll admit to sharing,
alors que le tensknota sous-jacent de Morgan pour une pratique d'art qui peut être encore suffisamment naïve ou mal conçue pour risquer quelque chose de plus que ce bricolage alexandrinien avec les bords de notre contexte est un désir que moi, je dois admettre, je partage.
it's not exactly something that can be urged on a young artist in so many words.
Ce n'est pas exactement quelque chose qu'on peut imposer à un jeune artiste, au moins de cette façon-là.
The very act of warning someone to maintain their innocence is a significant step toward taking that innocence away by converting it into a self-conscious strategy.
L'acte même d'avertir quelqu'un de maintenir leur innocence, en fait, est un pas significatif vers une dépossession de cette innocence en le convertissant dans une stratégie autoconsciente.
If I've spent so much time on these readings of Kreber's work, this is not, as you may possibly have gathered already, because he is an artist who evokes any deep sympathy in me.
Si je passe tant de temps sur ces lectures de l'œuvre de Kreber, ce n'est pas, comme vous avez peut-être déjà deviné, parce que c'est un artiste qui évoque une profonde sympathie en moi-même.
But he and the interpretations his work provokes seem representative to me.
Mais lui et les interprétations provoquées par son œuvre me semblent représentatifs.
Not so much of artistic work in general today as of certain commonly, though not exclusively held values.
Non tant du travail artistique en général aujourd'hui que de certaines valeurs communes, quoique non exclusives.
What all these accounts of Kreber's work agree on, and what they either praise him for or at least see as accounting for his widespread influence,
je crois que tous ces comptes rendus du travail de Kreber s'accordent et ce qu'il trouve d'élogieux chez lui
is the way the objects he produces systematically evade definition.
Et la façon dont les objets qu'il produit s'évadent à la définition systématique.
They seem to be paintings but have not been painted or carry very little paint.
Ça semble être des tableaux peints, mais ils n'ont pas été peints ou portent très peu de peinture.
They present images, but the images are essentially insignificant, and so on.
Ils présentent des images, mais les images sont essentiellement insignifiantes, etc.
And then the way Kreber himself embodies the role of painter by evading identification as such.
Et puis la façon dont Kreber lui-même incarne le rôle du peintre en évitant ou en évadant une identification en tant que telle.
So that he is said to be a producer of strategies rather than works, conversations rather than objects, legends and rumors more than of anything the viewer can easily grasp.
Donc on dit de lui que c'est un producteur de stratégie plutôt que d'œuvres, de conversations plutôt que d'objets, légendes et rumeurs, et de rien que le spectateur peut facilement compréhender.
Above all, and despite all talk of the death of the author that continues to echo back to us from the days of Barthes and Foucault,
Et surtout, et malgré tous les échos de la mort de l'auteur, des échos qui remontent d'ailleurs au temps de Barthes et de Foucault,
the reception of Kreber's work consists of a constant swerve away from an attention to the character of the things he produces as an artist,
la réception de l'œuvre de Kreber consiste à un clinamen constant d'une attention portée au caractère des choses qu'il produit en tant qu'artiste,
to his manner of behaviorally manifesting an idea of the artist, a manifestation of which the exhibited works are only a very small part.
à la manière de manifester par le comportement une certaine idée de l'artiste, une manifestation dont les œuvres exposées ne sont qu'une partie infime.
With regard to the ontology of the art object, painted or otherwise, this has to serve as a warning to us.
Quant à l'ontologie de l'art et l'objet peint ou autre, ça doit servir comme avertissement.
According to the present understanding, it is not by looking at the object itself that we are going to learn very much about its ontology.
Ce n'est pas en regardant l'objet lui-même que nous allons apprendre grand-chose sur son ontologie.
For this reason, most contemporary philosophical writing on the subject seems to me fundamentally misguided.
Et c'est pour cette raison-là que la plupart de l'écriture, de la littérature philosophique contemporaine sur le sujet me semble fondamentalement mal conçue.
Even those accounts that might at first appear to shift the focus to another level, for instance, George Dickey's institutional theory, do so only in order to account in the end for the object.
Même les comptes rendus qui, à première vue, paraissent remettre l'emphase à un autre niveau, par exemple la théorie institutionnelle de George Dickey, le font uniquement afin de rendre compte à la fin de l'objet.
In order to explain why certain objects are baptized, as it is sometimes put, as artworks, while others are not.
Afin d'expliquer pourquoi certains objets sont baptisés, comme on le dit des fois, comme œuvres d'art, tandis que d'autres ne le sont pas.
The title of Arthur Danto's classic essay sums up this entire problematic, Works of Art and Mere Real Things.
Le titre de l'essai classique d'Arthur Danto résume la problématique entière, les œuvres d'art et les choses réelles tout court.
But if we look attentively at how art is discussed within the contemporary art world, it soon becomes clear, as I think I showed with the essays on Kreber,
Mais si on regarde attentivement à la façon dont l'art se discute dans le monde de l'art contemporain,
that for all the energy expended on the description and evaluation and interpretation of objects, the object is not considered the ultimate ground of its own justification.
Comme on a vu dans le cas de Kreber, malgré toute l'énergie qu'on dépense sur la description et évaluation et interprétation d'objets, tableaux, et entre autres, l'objet n'est pas considéré le fond final de sa propre justification.
The real focus of the critical enterprise, the first thing that one really wants to pinpoint and construe, is what might be called the artistic project.
En fait, la vraie question de l'entreprise artistique, la chose sur la chose laquelle on voudrait réellement préciser et construire et déconstruire, est ce qu'on pourrait appeler le projet artistique.
This focus on the project has been intermittently articulated at least since the early days of Romanticism.
Cette lumière sur le projet s'articule de façon intermittente, au moins depuis les premiers jours du romanticisme.
For instance, in 1798, Friedrich von Schlegel wrote, "A project is the subjective embryo of a developing object."
En 1798, Friedrich von Schlegel a écrit « Un projet est l'embryon subjectif d'un objet en développement ».
But it is as relevant as ever today, if not more so.
Et cela est aussi actuel qu'alors et peut-être même plus.
If you are an admirer of Michael Kreber's work, then what you are admiring is above all his project, his redefinition of artistic activity.
Si vous êtes admirateur du travail de Michael Kreber, ce que vous admirez est surtout son projet, son redéfinition de l'activité artistique.
If you're an admirer of John Curran, who Kelsey implicitly contrasted to Kreber on the ostensible ground that the former used too much paint, such inefficiency, and if you believe that Curran paints well,
si vous admirez John Curran, le peintre américain que Kelsey implicitement contraste à Kreber sur, pour le motif ostensif que le premier utilise trop de peinture, une telle inefficience et inefficacité.
A controversial assertion, but one that would surely be confirmed by most of Curran's admirers.
Et si vous croyez que Curran peint bien, une revendication controversée, mais qui serait affirmée au moins par la plupart de ses admirateurs.
Or rather, if you think that Curran paints well and you count yourself a sophisticated viewer of contemporary art,
ou plutôt, si vous croyez que Curran peint bien et vous vous comptez parmi les spectateurs sophistiqués de l'art contemporain,
then you ought to be able to see how Curran's painterly virtuosity is justified by his project and not vice versa.
Vous devriez donc pouvoir affirmer comment la virtuosité pictoriale de Curran est justifiée par son projet et non vice-versa.
Maybe this is why we think we have a particular ontological problem about painting, an ontological problem that is also a critical problem.
C'est peut-être pour ça que nous croyons que nous avons ce problème particulier ontologique autour de la peinture, un problème ontologique qui est aussi un problème critique.
Because whenever we look at a painting, we think we are looking at an object.
Puisque à chaque fois que nous regardons un tableau, nous croyons que nous regardons un objet.
And if the unit of artistic evaluation and analysis is the project rather than the object, then we might feel that in this painting object, we are facing something of lesser status.
Et si l'unité de l'évaluation artistique et analyse est le projet plutôt que l'objet, on pourrait croire que dans cet objet peinture-objet, nous voyons quelque chose de statut moindre.
Like a Platonist looking at a mere chair when what he really wants to do is contemplate an idea.
Et comme le platoniste qui regarde une simple chaise, alors que ce qu'il voudrait réellement regarder et contempler, c'est l'idée.
Someone who thinks this way might even suspect, as Kelsey seems to do, that the physical beefing up of the painting object, that mass of paint he derides in Schutz's or Curran's work, is a purely compensatory reaction against the object's ontological inadequacy as such.
Sa farbe n'est qu'une compensation et une réaction compensatoire contre l'inadéquation ontologique en tant que telle, une sorte de complexe esthétique de Napoléon.
I didn't say that yet.
Oh,
a
sorry.
sort of aesthetic Napoleon complex.
Une sorte de complexe de Napoléon esthétique.
But there's another way to look at it.
Mais il y a une autre façon de voir la chose.
Maybe the Platonic idea could be contemplated in its purity. Maybe.
Peut-être on pourra contempler l'idée platonicienne dans sa pureté. Peut-être.
But if so, that's because it was held to be perfect and eternal.
Mais si ce serait le cas, c'est parce qu'on le tient pour parfait, parfaite et éternel.
A project, by definition, is nothing like that.
Un projet, on le définit d'une façon autre, n'a rien de tel.
Think back to Schlegel's definition, the subjective embryo of a developing object.
Comme disait Schlegel, l'embryon subjectif en développement, d'un projet en développement.
Its very nature is to be in progress, to be incomplete and unfolding, and above all, to be subject to revision.
Sa nature même est d'être en progrès, en développement, inachevé, se déroulant.
A project is not a program, which is something that can be simply executed.
Un projet est sujet à révision. Un projet n'est pas un programme qu'on peut simplement exécuter.
And that, in turn, means that you never get to look at it straight on.
Et à son tour, ça veut dire qu'on n'a jamais l'occasion ou la possibilité de le regarder droit devant.
Rather, it's something you only catch glimpses of, something you make out by way of its various manifestations.
C'est plutôt quelque chose dont on voit du coin de l'œil, quelque chose qu'on décrit à soi-même par le biais de ces manifestations diverses.
If those manifestations happen to be paintings, they are at no greater or lesser removed from the project itself than would be the case if they were texts or performances or what have you.
Si ces manifestations, si se trouve que ces manifestations sont des tableaux ou performances, ils ne sont à un moindre ou plus grand distance du projet que serait le cas si c'était des textes, performances, etc.
With a painting, like any other work of contemporary art, what you really have to ask yourself is, does this suggest that the artist has a project?
Avec un tableau, comme avec n'importe quelle œuvre d'art contemporain, ce qu'il faut réellement se demander, c'est est-ce que l'artiste a un projet?
And if so, what can I learn about the project from this particular work?
Et si c'est bien le cas, qu'est-ce que moi je peux apprendre de ce projet, de cette œuvre particulière?
And I think I will stop at that point and ask you if you have any questions.
Larry,
Yes.
I think it's quite appropriate that you mentioned Schlegel because you're talking about a historical period when the idea of come on the scene philosophically in Europe. And I'm enjoying the way you're suggesting that the object does not embody the project. Could you say a little bit more about the kinds of internal conversations, the dialogical orientation of these sorts of project versus object, that would kind of expand a little bit what you're trying to do here tonight?
I guess I'm not exactly clear what you mean by dialogical in this sense. I mean, certainly maybe this is not what you're getting at all, but certainly the idea that there is something dialogical about the inception and making of an artistic project and of artistic works is something that does have its roots in that early Romantic milieu. We tend to think as Romanticism as something that that focuses on the individual and a kind of pure subjectivity. I think that actually relates to maybe later phases of Romanticism, but in that early phase around the Athenaeum, you know, everything is about the group and about generating projects collectively. So if that's what you're getting at, yes, I think that that it's important to say that a project is not necessarily something individual and personal, but it can also, it's a shared thing as well.
Yeah, and I mean, what I would just like you to elaborate upon is how Kreber establishes a difference in terms of his project between that, say, initiated by Buren, Tironi, Mosse, and Parmentier in BMPT, where the same kind of limits of painting were positioned, and in fact, they were kind of constructing things that you could construe as ready-mades, paintings as ready-mades, and how that relates to, say, what Kreber is doing. Where is the difference?
That would be hard for me to address right now because I honestly haven't really studied the works of the BMT-PT group that much. So it's an open question for me. It's a good question. It makes a lot of sense to look at that.
But can the translator have a follow-up question?
Sure.
Since you went back to the early Romantics, I mean, my first reaction to all of this was, well, it's there. They also introduced the access of play as an important and an appearance in every sense of the word. And my first reaction to Kreber is, well, he's not a painter, but he plays one in the art world.
It's very good. Not in the movies, but in the art world.
Well, I only say it for myself. I'm not a translator, but I play one in the art world.
Yeah.
You said something about the four qualities that establish that something is a work of art. You know, the material, the name of the artist, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
Establishing, creating some having some relationship to the project that defines the objects or something. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
What was it that you said exactly?
Well, I mean, basically, the idea is that.
Because I was trying to get a grip on that when listening to you talking at the same time, and it was an interesting idea that I wanted you to explain further. What was it you said exactly?
Basically, those. Look, first you got the name of the artist that establishes the identity of someone around whom one's
I
sense of the project is going
But
to...
I understand what the four things,
Yeah, yeah.
what you're saying about them, but you were saying they had a relationship to the project that somehow defined the object. And that-
Because when you're receiving the work, when you're trying to understand the work, in order to be able to start to relate this discrete thing to this more nebulous thing that is the project, you have to work from a narrative that you construct for yourself on the basis of the fact that it's a Michael Kreber, as opposed to it's being an Albert Erlin, that it's made of these materials rather than those materials, that it was done at this date, therefore it came along in response to the things that happened before that and not to things that only happened afterwards. It allows you to start to place it with respect to the bigger story, essentially.
But you need to see a series of works to have an idea of what the project actually is, right? I mean, the project only
Yeah.
exists
Well, you need
by being able to see by being able to see what arises in your mind from seeing a series of the works. Right?
Normally, you need to see a series of works, for sure. I think that there are certain kind of limit cases where, in a sense, people have somehow suggested a project precisely by the absence of a work. You know, that's what, you know, Susan Sontag a long time ago called the aesthetics of silence. But in the more normal cases, you need a series of works in order to start to have the sense of a project, for sure.
More of a comment in response to your question. I think, like, it's not maybe just seeing a series of works by one artist, but if you see one painting by, what's his name, Michael Weber? Kreber, oh, sorry. You know, you're reading it. If you've only seen one work, you're reading it in terms of the other works that you know that exist in relation to that work. Like, this is where the project is being collective, I think. Like, so you read it in terms of Blinky Palermo. You bring sort of your knowledge and your lexicon to that, and that's, I don't know if that's sort of part of your idea.
The knowledge that you bring to that is more, in a certain sense, about it's more about the fact that Kreber is a Cologne artist, and maybe you have some sense of the very intensely self-reflective and self-absorbed kind of coterie nature of the Cologne art scene, and probably the more you know about that, the fewer works of Kreber's you need to see to get an idea of what Kreber's about, because you already may have a sense that it's work that comes out of a dialogue with certain other present and recent past colleagues.
Yeah, I mean, I think also, like, just maybe another comment might segue into a question, but like what you said about the death of the author, and also I think you mentioned artistic intention, and like so much of the death of the author text seems to be about like letting go of authorial intention and sort of, but that acknowledgement of being part of a collective, in a sense, is also what Death of the Author is about. But I like how you, like, that authorial intention is not singular to the individual, but it's actually collective, I think, is part of that Death of the Author idea. But then what you're sort of saying, again, of the reinscription of the author, I think is really interesting, that somehow the individual still remains important, like in maybe, and I don't know if you wanted to sort of elaborate on that sort of a little bit.
Well, somehow, yeah, it's a kind of another, there's a stage of understanding of the dialogical basis of making art that at one point seems to take focus away from the individual maker, but at the same time, you then have to become aware that in order for there to be a dialogue at all, there have to be defined individuals who are, engaging in some kind of conversation with each other across the boundaries between their identities. So it doesn't, the idea of the dialogue never does away with the sense of the individual participant in the dialogue. Yeah.
I was wondering if you'd be willing to comment on your presentation with the translator. And at the risk of making you talk about, maybe something that was a little more artful in itself, but what is the relationship between, as you see it, between translation and what you're talking about in terms of the artist's project and the work of art or the works of art?
Well, that's somehow the question of translation is something that interests me a lot and for a long time, but it's not something that I want to immediately bring into play in this discussion. For me, to be honest, the idea of the translation is really more about the pause that it enforces.
Well, it's true that I was sitting here feeling, alternately grateful and annoyed that I was having to stop and really listen to, think about what you had just said. But I was curious about whether you were making a point as well about, if you think of what Lawrence Weiner says about when his works are translated, that somehow the work exists between, in other words, between the two. It manages to exist in translation somehow between the two languages or whatever. And so I was curious about whether you were trying as well to talk about sort of the way that we discern, in a sense, discern the project. That is, as you said, as glimpses between kind of the object and something that's outside of the object.
Yeah, of course, but somehow, I guess for me, that sense of the fragment and of the glimpse, as I said, it had more to do with the kind of imposing, as it were, a temporal grid that breaks it up. But of course, I completely agree that the notion of translation and the fact that that somehow translation is already implicit in using a single language is important.
Hey, Barry. Nice
Hi.
to see you.
It's been a long time.
I know. I have a question picking up from the Danto quote and the idea of the Platonic distance from the real. How much distance from real activity in the world do you think there has to be for something to be considered art? With those four categories that you have given, can an artist baptize any object or activity as art through the impetus of or association with a larger project?
Well, I think that in terms of objects, since the 60s, it's been very easy for an artist to baptize anything as an artwork, and certain periods there almost seemed to have been a mania to nominate something as an artwork before somebody else did. So, in a sense, it almost became too available as a strategy.
So the project came to supersede the art object itself, in a way.
So that you had to try to arrive at some more urgent sense of what the project could be, rather than just the fact that the possibility to do this exists. I don't know if that's clear, but.
You characterized Kleber's work as not being the primary source of information, the object not being the primary source of information about his work. And then the last sentence you read in your paper just introduced a twinge of ambiguity there, and I was wondering if you could clarify that. Where I was wondering if what your position was. You mentioned that you didn't necessarily subscribe to the position of Kleber, that you were describing it. So I was wondering if that was an intentional ambiguity.
Well, it's not that I don't subscribe to his position. It's just that, to the extent that I grasp his project, I don't think it's a particularly interesting one. But at least it's a project. I mean, you know, there's some artists who never arrive at a sense of a project. Then there are artists who do, but you know, some have more interesting projects than others. Somehow his seems to have been useful to some people just in order to kind of foreground the idea that you need a project, and that's why it, you know, that's why people seem to be interested in him. For me, I kind of say, well, okay, but then, you know, now what? And in a sense, I guess in, you know, in my talk, I'm not really doing anything that much different than he is, in the sense that I'm kind of leaving you with this idea of the project, but I certainly can't tell you what your project should be, and maybe he can sort of prod some other artists into understanding that before they can make a painting or before they can make a sculpture or whatever it is, they need to start understanding that will just be a step in the making of a project. But I don't know that he will inspire anyone to follow a particular type of project. I don't know. Does that start to answer your question?
Well, I guess what I was asking was, would you go and look to the object as a primary source of information about the project?
Would I? Well, it depends on the project. I mean, in other words, there's some that are much more heavily invested in objects, and others that are less so. But there are none in which the object is all.
Thank you.
The terms are clear to me when I'm thinking about John Curran's work, that, and especially this idea that the ontological problem with painting became a critical problem. When you look at the criticism of the work, certainly early on, there was an elaborate avoidance of the project, and as if we were, when we were looking at a painting, looking only at an object, or looking at an object primarily. And I mean, it got played out in the critical literature, I think, in a really clear way. if I'm under, does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that I'm not so sure. I mean, because I haven't investigated the critical response to him in any great detail. Although, of course, I've over the years I've read various things about him, but I think that at least at the kind of conversational level, there was a tremendous amount of discussion about how skilled John Curran is, and you just have to ask yourself as a critic or as a kind of serious seer, well, what is this skill, and what's the point? What's the point of the skill? What makes it valuable to have these skills applied here, in this case? And that's a different kind of question.
Yeah, and the fallback and the avoidance was had a lot of nostalgic impetus to it and force to it, I think.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry, but I have to ask this question. It seems like you're talking about something quite simple, which is a balance between how much stuff you apply, to the thought of what you're doing.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess j'accuse in the sense that it seems like what happens, if you look at the global picture, is that when the object starts to drain away the stuff, the language builds up around the stuff. And I feel that all this language built up as a poet, I'm curious how you feel about that all this language build up sounds to me, looks and feels to me like the same goop of paint that builds up, over in John Curran's work. So to me, there's a larger cultural event that's happening, and whoever's got whatever they've got at stake is having their excess production, because no one will stop and see what's happening here. Just goop goes from language back to paint, language, paint. And I'm just wondering how you might respond to that as a poet.
Well, I'm not exactly sure how to respond. It seems like there's something underlying your question which isn't quite coming out, in that you have a certain animus against, I don't know whether it's all contemporary art or all discussion around contemporary art, or certain parts of it that you see as being overburdened by either materials or by discourse, but I don't really know what that is in contemporary art that makes you feel that way. So so I can't exactly address it. Yeah, I mean, maybe you want to kind of be more precise in your since you said j'accuse, in your accusation.
Well, it just seems that if one sits down to make an object, a work of art, there's a physical thing there, and there's thought that one brings to bear on the thing. And it's a discipline to infuse a work of art or an object with thought. And when I come, or anyone comes to try to judge a work, to me, the most interesting criticism takes one work and looks at it and says, well, and illuminates the thought and the balance of thought that has somehow given that object, so maybe I didn't notice. There are times I see works that I didn't notice the thought. And at least Kreber, who I'm not like wild about or anything, but at least he's, okay, you illuminated to a degree the thought that is in that object, and there's an illumination there. Then I felt that you turned around and, like you said, which I appreciate, that your project here is similar to his, to simply illuminate the idea that a thing could be a project. But is that, enough of a project? As you raised the question to him, I sort of put it back to you, that so much arises around this question, which was pretty illuminated in the 19th century also, as a romantic idea of what a work of art is. I'm cool with that. And it just seems so impossible for people to just stop producing. Go plant a garden or something if it's just going to be extra paint, extra language. And I'm sorry, I know it's a direct challenge. So that's all I can say. I don't want to say any more.
Well, it's not a direct challenge to me because I'm not painting anything, so I don't have to.
Well, you're
but
speaking.
but you look. We can't when we write as critics, or when we just speak to each other in a critical manner about the things that we look at and observe, we're not actually doing criticism for each other on behalf of each other. We're just showing each other how we do it, and you show me how you do it when you speak critically on something. And perhaps we do it well, or perhaps we do it not so well. Just like perhaps the painter paints well, or perhaps the painter paints not so well. Maybe they burden their painting with too much paint. Maybe they don't put enough paint on it to arrive at the thing that they need to arrive at, or maybe they get it right. But somehow that failure or success is something else than the value of the whole endeavor of making and enjoying our capacity for making things. And so to say that it all becomes goop, I mean, yeah, we all have that mood sometimes, but basically it seems to be too pessimistic. I went to the Armory show this weekend, and I could either take the position that I saw hundreds of things that were of no special interest to me, and it's really depressing, or I can take the position that amidst hundreds of things, I saw a few things that were really good, that I wouldn't have seen otherwise. And I just sort of tend to take the more optimistic side of the equation.
I just want to say, I'm not talking about the art world in general or anything in general. I was just I was addressing the moment, but that's all I'm going to say. I'm very sorry for being so belligerent.
I don't know. I think she's talking about the fact that I should have shut up. But asking a question isn't a good way to get me to do that.
There's like an underlying thing there where, this group, humans are producing group of every conceivable sort. And in a lot of our self-referential production,
Mhm.
The goofiness was in that too much layers of detachment.
Mhm.
Part about our language, but
Mhm.
just asking about. Yeah, it was a question to you actually, but you weren't really. That's all right. That's all right.
Yeah?
I understood your thesis had something to do with the image being replaced by project and painting. Is that right? Did I hear that? Did I get that right? In other words, painting, it had to do with something I read about your talk, that there was a thesis involved in which, since all the other, since technical advances, painting no longer has to paint images. But now paintings are really projects. They're not about images.
Well, yeah, I mean,
Is that-
somewhere
is-
in between the image and the project, there came the object as well. You know, but yeah, that's fair.
But I'd really like to know at this point what you think an image is.
Ah, well, that's another lecture, but because. Yeah, because that's a really big question, because there are different senses of what an image is. I mean, here I was really using it in the most kind of obvious elementary sense, which is a picture of something. And for this purpose, that's where I'd leave it. For some other purposes, I might think about more general senses of the word image, where I think eventually it really becomes a reference to any kind of impression that perception can leave with us. And so, even though I don't think that artworks today are necessarily there to convey pictures, although some of them are, they all give us images in this other sense. But that's not part of my topic here.
Okay. Somehow I thought that was the basis of it, was that images has been replaced by the idea of a project. And I was curious about that.
Yeah, no, that's, it was, yeah, that's not exactly it.
L'image, c'est le produit de l'imagination. Comme disait Samuel Beckett, imagination, dead, imagine.
Maybe that's a good place to end.